Dobar dan. Pratite još jedno izdanje emisije Znam da znaš. Moje ime je Bojana Dabović, a moj današnji sagovornik, gospodin Gunther Fehlinger, predsjednik nevladine organizacije Montenegro Goes Europe iz Beča. Mr. Fehlinger, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Hello, Montenegro.
Thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be our guest today.
Thanks a lot. Best regards from Vienna.
Can you tell us, for the beginning of this talk show, why did you decide to start such an organization?
Montenegro is a beautiful country, and we like it very much in Austria. And it's the most advanced country in the EU progress, in the EU accession. So we decided to focus on Montenegro as a role model for the EU accession, because there's 6 countries now waiting, and of course Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia as well. But Montenegro is by far the one country which is the easiest to get into the European Union now very fast, because it's basically ready. And so we decided to set up an institution, an association in Austria, to promote the concept that Montenegro should be in 2024 already member of the European Union.
Recently you visited Montenegro. How do you assess the situation in the country?
It's beautiful, charming, wonderful country. It's actually enormously developed. I know it since 20 years. I was the first time in Montenegro in 2002, and it was a very sad situation in 2002. A lot of poverty, crisis, no investment. And now it's a very modern kind of European country with a lot of tourism development. And so the infrastructure is enormously progressing. And in all aspects, it's now absolutely ready, similar like Croatia was in 2013. So I see the situation in principle, in the big parameters, very positive.
But politically, when we look at the country?
Yeah, there are some issues, unfortunately, which I don't understand very well, because unfortunately your country is in this internal political stalemate to some extent. And it's a bit of a worry, because instead of looking to Europe and to Brussels, and there's a lot of focus on the past, on the relation with Serbia, and this issue with the church, and the issue of the so-called open Balkans. This is all deeply problematic, because it's kind of a distraction from the road to Europe, to Brussels, and to convincing all the member states, the 27 member states, that Montenegro should be number 28. So you have to focus on Rome, on Stockholm, on Helsinki, and on Zagreb. And there is too much focus, like cooking in their own soup of the past. What is Belgrade thinking? What is Sarajevo thinking? How is everything here in the region? But the focus must be really to go around from Madrid to, yes, I said already Stockholm, but Copenhagen, and spread the news that Montenegro is ready, and convince the other EU Council members that you are responsible, beautiful, and successful new co-decider, because as member of the European Union, you have a lot of responsibility. You will have the same votes like other countries, like Malta, for example, or Estonia. And so you have responsibility, and that's the task, and not the clarification of clerical issues from the past or other issues in the region. They are of less relevance at this moment, where all the political energy must be focused on EU membership as fast as possible.
You mentioned some of the problems in Montenegro. One of them is this contract with Church of Serbia. European organizations assesses the Church of Serbia as a source of instability and an organization through which a large Serbian and Russian influence in Montenegro is recorded. Seen from that angle, how can this document, this contract with Church of Serbia, affect Montenegro's path to the European Union?
Yeah, it's a bit of a distraction, and it's a very toxic political issue in your country. I understand it very well. And, you know, in the European Union, we respect religious freedom, and that's very important, and the religious feelings are very important. But it shouldn't be in a kind of heated political atmosphere right now, and to be the focus of the political debate. This can be postponed. As far as I understand, it's a decade-long issue already. Why to do it now? Why at the moment when all the energy must be devoted towards Europe? So it's much better to postpone that issue for another decade, because it's a century-long debate already about the role of the church, and to focus a bit more to clean up some aspects of the, how can I say, the state-church relation, because it's really very problematic that the Serbian state, via the Serbian church, is trying to project power in the neighboring countries, in Montenegro, in Bosnia, in Kosovo. And that is a kind of a rearguard battle of the breakup of Yugoslavia via the church affairs, which is happening now also in Macedonia and in Kosovo and the whole region. And it's a bit unfair of Serbia to abuse the religious feelings of the population in the neighboring country and somehow take it as a kind of a leverage against these countries in these very complicated circumstances. And I'm really calling don't focus on that. Postpone this issue. It can be another decade of discussions. It's nothing will be problematic when we do that in 2030, because the real issue today is EU membership and not the who owns what church in Montenegro. That really can be in a legal and dialogue process. There can be a council established with all the stakeholders, and that can be for many years. The experts can discuss about that one. But it's much more important to reform the rule of law sector and fulfill the conditions of EU membership now in these open chapters, and that the whole political process of all parties, I appeal to all parties to focus on that one, because that's a real priority for the people and for the prosperity, for your security and for your future.
Mm-hmm. How do you assess the fact that during the recent session of the Stabilization and Association Council held in Montenegro, the visit of high-ranking officials like Josep Borrell and Oliver Varhelyi was shortened from 4 to 2 days, while the foreign ministers of the EU member states cancelled their visit? Is that some kind of message to Montenegro?
No, I'm afraid yes. Of course, you are not so big a priority in the big crisis of today when it comes to energy, when it comes to Ukraine, Russia. And obviously, when then everybody in the EU would like to have a big success now. You could be the big success story, which the EU urgently needs. And that's why they have devoted a lot of time to you in principle. So everybody in the EU now would like to have Montenegro as the one big thing, like we did it with Croatia in 2013, get Montenegro in fast and have a success story, show the world that the EU is acting and attractive and Montenegro is on the way. But unfortunately, your internal fragilities and these issues about the basic treaty and also this orientation towards the so-called open Balkans and the lack of now the decisive focus on the issues result, and that you are a bit, how can I say, not so attractive bride at the moment. And it would be really good to get the attention of all policymakers and show them that you are the one next big thing in EU enlargement and that you are ready. And I'm convinced that can be done over the summer. And I'm positive that the next months will be very successful. But I hope that the focus will be back on the EU integration.
As a part of the visit of Josep Borrell to Montenegro, the EU delegation in Montenegro also organized a meeting with representatives of the non-governmental sector. That meeting, among others, was attended by people representing anti-NATO and pro-Russian politics. We asked the EU delegation, did they know about those facts, and they answered us yes, and sent us the following reply, and I quote, engagement is one of the basic rules and principles of the EU. Engagement means that those who do not share our views are not ignored, only through try to offer arguments that could help our dissenters see things from a different perspective or face them directly in a constructive way. Wasn't it better, if these are the arguments of the delegation of the European Union, to invite Maria Zakharova to that meeting as an authentic representative of their policy and not their proxy in Montenegro?
I understand that you are not content with the invitation policy of the EU delegation, but you know, it's the EU delegation. They normally do this social outreach to a broader group. But I also counsel for caution, also to the ambassador of the EU delegation, to give the anti-European and the anti-NATO forces a huge platform to voice their bizarre views, yeah, and also spread hate and toxic lies. It's not a good policy. It's really somebody, it has to be carefully checked. Yeah? If they are legitimately and decently expressing dissent, absolutely. But if they're spreading this hate like Russia today does, and dividing countries and all this kind of fake news, then it's much better not to invite them, because in the EU we have made a clear policy to forbid all these outlets of Russian propaganda, not to allow them to broadcast for good reasons. Because we are now in this decisive confrontation, the Russian war against Ukraine and against the Free West. So we cannot allow bizarre groups funded by Russia to have a legitimate platform of discussions equal to other civil society organizations. So that policy is very questionable, and there must be a big careful check with the background of all representatives of the civil society. If they really have clear links to Russia, then they have to be treated as enemy organizations and not to be invited to any forums.
Mm-hmm. For decades, the domestic staff in Western embassies, Western embassies, has been made up of people whose views are mostly different from the foreign policy advocated by coalition government until 2020. How much influence do such officials at the most important leading embassies in Podgorica have on the attitudes of the ambassadors of those countries?
Yeah, that's a big issue, obviously, and the personal reflections and personal perspective of the embassy staff is obviously often then filtering into the opinions of the ambassadors. But on the other hand, the real policy is made by the foreign policy establishment back in the member states of the European Union. So some local employee of the embassy can shape some attitudes, but the real big policy is made in Berlin, in Paris, and in Brussels itself, and in some other member states, especially on the Western Balkan issues, like in Austria and Croatia. So these are the real focus points, and I wouldn't worry too much about local employees who have very limited influence on real policy.
Mm-hmm. Another issue that met with the displeasure of the citizens of Montenegro, and opinions are divided in the government as well, is Open Balkan. You mentioned it also. Some Western Balkan countries are also opposed to this initiative. What is your position on this matter?
I'm for European Balkans. And the European Balkans is open for all. Yeah? That's very good. Yeah? And especially open to Europe, because we are a customs union, we are a free trade area, we are an economic market, a common market, we are a currency union. Montenegro has the euro already. Congratulations, that's very important. So there is no need to opening the Balkans to Russia, because this project is especially promoted by Serbia, which again has a free trade agreement with Russia. That's very problematic, and they have to cut that when they want to join the European Union. And also they have not joined the sanctions. So ultimately there's also a lot of secret service cooperation between Serbia and Russia, and military cooperation as well, data exchange between Serbia and Russia. So it's very deeply problematic to open the Montenegro citizen data and the Kosovo citizen data and Bosnian citizen data, but also the Macedonian and Albanian towards Serbia, which is like an open Balkans data for Russia. So that's a real problematic issue. And I'm very, very deeply against this Open Balkan initiative, because it's also duplicating what the European Union is already doing. I mentioned here Dr. Erhard Busek. He passed away this year, but he was the initiator of Stability Pact for Southeastern Europe and of the Regional Cooperation Council in Sarajevo. Mrs. Prego is the Secretary General. In 2017, 14 was the Berlin for Balkans process. 17 was then the decision to form a regional economic market, regional economic area. And that is basically perfect. And that's what needs to be done. Work all together, prepare for the EU, join the EU as soon as possible, all together, the ones who are ready, like Montenegro, first. Open Balkan is the initiative from Mr. Vučić to somehow compete with that, because he doesn't like Kosovo, obviously. He's just recently said no to Kosovo. He doesn't like Montenegro's independence at all, to be very clear, and he doesn't respect Bosnia at all. So it's no coincidence that he formed with Macedonia and Albania this new group, which is basically against the European initiatives and the European will and the European support mechanism for the Western Balkans. And it's very much meant against independent Kosovo, independent Montenegro, independent Bosnia, because in his mind, all these three countries shouldn't be independent at all. And have no doubt he thinks like that. In the case of Kosovo, he recently said it very clearly again after the European Parliament resolution. So Open Balkan is a big mistake, and I call on the Montenegro government not to join, because it would be very, very negative for Montenegro, but even very dramatic for Kosovo and for Bosnia. So they much better stay out of this and focus on joining the European Union.
Commissioner for Enlargement, Mr. Várhelyi, he supports Open Balkan, and he supports it officially. The famous Brussels Politico wrote about the fact that several unnamed sources from Brussels accuse Várhelyi of falsifying reports on the alleged progress of Serbia in the process of European integration, and of favoring Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić over other Western Balkan countries. In addition, investigative media in Serbia have obtained information that a certain Hungarian company, one of whose owners is very close to the political currents in Hungary, to which Várhelyi also belongs, has received a very lucrative job of installing LED lighting in Serbia. The entire opposition in Serbia also accuses him of this. Is this the reason why the Commissioner for Enlargement uses every opportunity to promote Open Balkan?
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly the reason.
Have you heard about that?
Absolutely. The fact of the matter is like this. Yeah? Mr. Várhelyi was the ambassador of Mr. Orban in Brussels. And in a very controversial move, Mr. Orban has imposed him on this portfolio in the EU Commission in this deal with Mr. Macron. As you might remember, Manfred Weber was meant to be Commission President. Then Ursula von der Leyen came, and then it was a complete mess up. And then Mr. Orban, who is very closely connected. Actually, I call it always a Russian asset, yeah, because he's very much Putin's man in the European Council. And he has a lot of economic ties which are openly corrupt in the gas business with Putin. And so this is the axis, in a way, the axis of evil, yeah, between Putin, Orban, and Vučić. And they are supporting each other also on these issues. That's why Mr. Várhelyi is openly supporting Open Balkan, which is very much against the EU Commission line, very much against what Mr. Olaf Scholz wants, very much against what everybody in the Balkans who knows the situation since 20 years, including me, is very much opposed against Open Balkans. Because unfortunately, Mr. Várhelyi doesn't keep the line in the EU Commission, but he is basically doing what Mr. Orban wants on that one. And I might remind you, Mr. Orban has even made a big campaign last year in all European media with 10 points what needs to change in Europe, and he included only Serbia as the one country which should join the European Union out of all 6, which is totally impossible, because Serbia doesn't fulfill any of the important criteria for EU membership, like, for example, joining our foreign policy, like, for example, breaking with Russia on the trade policy, like, for example, buying weapons from Russia. It's an outrageous thing. And also the questions of Ukraine and Kosovo, which are really very important. So it's completely impossible for Serbia to join the European Union in that kind of status of mind, which they are. But unfortunately, Mr. Várhelyi represents on that point only his own opinion and not anybody's else. So don't take it very seriously. It's a very sad fact that he is saying such statements, and then they are taken so seriously, of course, in the media. But it's a tragedy, actually. And open Balkans is certainly not the position of the European Commission or of anybody of the foreign policy establishment of the European Union, but Mr. Orban's and Hungary's.
When you compare the efforts of all countries of the Western Balkan, Montenegro, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, Albania, Kosovo, can it be said that Serbia has a sincere desire to join EU?
No, absolutely not. I mean, the ones who have a sincere desire, which is the most advanced, is absolutely Montenegro. Montenegro is the most serious and advanced country. The number 2 country is North Macedonia. North Macedonia is already since 2005 very seriously preparing on EU accession. With this other Orban friend, Mr. Gruevski, they were in a big disaster politically, but the administration and the technical level has continued to prepare very well, and it's now a long time, and North Macedonia is also very seriously. Albania as well is relatively good prepared technically. They unfortunately have a lot of internal political issues, and these are not so easy to solve. Similar, unfortunately, like Montenegro, there's a lot of problems with the political system. But these are the 3 more advanced countries who are ready, and they are NATO allies. This is very important for the EU accession, because NATO shows that you are security-wise in our value system. You are like democracies and advanced states which are ready for the European Union. So these are the 3 advanced. Kosovo is also well prepared technically, and so is Bosnia. But Serbia, mentality-wise, and that's the most important in the big questions, democracy, the geostrategic orientation, the security system, is very far away from the European Union. It doesn't want to join NATO as the only country, because Kosovo and Bosnia want to join NATO, and they should, but Serbia not. So Serbia is also in the autocratic system in which it is developing in the last years, with this very tight power grip on the industrial military security structure of Mr. Vučić on the whole society, and his kind of neo-imperial impression and tendencies in Bosnia, Montenegro and Kosovo. This is very deeply problematic, and it's no way they can join the European Union in the present status of mind. And also the situation is getting very clear that that Serbia will have to recognize Kosovo as well, which is, for Mr. Vučić, made it very clear, is not on the agenda for him. So ultimately, there's no way Serbia can join in the foreseeable time the European Union, and it also has to change fundamentally its direction before that can be even considered.
How do you view the announcement of opening of Russia Today representative office in Serbia?
No, that's terrible news, and that's another step in the back of Europe, because next to the thing that when we close the airspace of Europe for Russian aviation, then Mr. Vučić let it open. So we close all Europe for Russia because they wage a terrible war, and then he opens and keeps it like a hole in the European airspace. Then we close the Russian propaganda outlets of state media who are spreading lies and disinformation and fake news. And then he opens a regional center for Russia Today in Belgrade. I mean, this is not, that's a very unfriendly act even, and everybody is very much against that. And with this kind of military cooperation, which he continues, and all his maneuvers, and the niche military base, and all these things, and now we have 4 months of war, and he opens Russia Today in Belgrade. It's like a slap in the face of all pro-Europeans in Europe and in the region, and also in Serbia, because there are also many pro-Europeans there. And I cannot understand Mr. Vučić anymore, what he really wants. And we are not fools that he does this. Is very, very offensive to Europe. And I think he is looking for some kind of escalation. And I'm very worried, actually, about the next months in the relation between the EU and Serbia.
Is that some kind of a sign that Serbia really wants to cancel the enlargement process?
No, I don't think that one, because the tradition of Mr. Tito is always to balance at the maximum. Mr. Tito is the role model for Mr. Vučić in many ways, because the policy he has learned is basically you try to get the maximum from the West and the East. And that's what he is called balancing, and that's what he does. Yeah. So he will try to get the maximum here, but he will not break with anybody. That's the logic of it. And he is just seeing his opportunity to show himself as indispensable person for the Balkans to the Western policymakers, and he wants then to receive more funding, more support for his pet project, Open Balkans, and in some way he's successful even with that, sadly, because then you hear some policymakers who say, okay, you can have this, you can have this, you can have this basic treaty in Montenegro, or you can have some concessions in Kosovo, because what the Western policymakers are basically thinking, he really has this Eastern option, he is really very problematic. And Mr. Vučić is basically explaining it like this, that he would be much more pro-European, but his voters are like that.
Do you think that Mr. Vučić and Serbia will suffer some kind of consequences because of this fact that they are planning to open Russia Today representative office?
Yes, it should be. It should be. It's like an affront, it's like an insult. Yeah? And I call for the EU and I call for all policymakers, the best policy is to freeze the EU candidate status of Serbia and tell them, please, you're not supporting us on the most important foreign policy crisis of the last 40 years. Yeah? This is the Ukraine war. And this is very serious. And then you're working behind our back on the questions of energy, military and information with our enemy, Russia. Of course, he has to be frozen, the candidate status. And of course, it can be then restarted again once the foreign policy of Serbia changes. But they have to close the airspace, they have to close this Russia Today office, they have to stop to buy weapons from Russia, they have to end the free trade agreement with Russia, the military, the intelligence cooperation with Russia, this all has to end. And they have to stop to mess up the region. Because it's unacceptable that they export all these problems towards Montenegro, Kosovo, and Bosnia. This is very fragile countries. It's new countries. And this is very much our problem because they are NATO allies in the case of Montenegro. And they are also very much our security obligation in the case of Kosovo and Bosnia, because ultimately it's also Austrian soldiers who in the framework of KFOR, where we have the lead command, and in Bosnia, it's also the biggest contingent, it's Austrian soldiers, and it's EU obligation via NATO and the EU missions in Bosnia and in Kosovo, the security of these countries. And Mr. Vučić and Serbia is messing up all the region, and it's a big crisis, and I think the way is to confront him and not to appease him.
We don't have much more time till the end of the show. So for the end, let's go back to Montenegro. What do you think is the best solution for the state and Montenegrin citizens? New elections, new government, or something else at this moment?
I think it's much better to form a European consensus, a broader coalition of all the political personalities beyond the parties who are really ready for Europe and for European Union. Because you have to fulfill 3 or 4 things now, according to the EU parameters, and you need to do that. And it's much better to make a bigger kind of European coalition between all the 3 blocks, or whatever 3 blocks you normally refer to it, and to say, for the next 2 years, we do nothing but Europe. And then we are in the European Union, at least we have finished everything, and we are basically ready in 2024 with either membership or at least everything is signed and done and dusted, basically. And then you go for all these controversial toxic identity issues and divisive church issues and all the other things, but you have done your things. Early elections, I don't think is the best way because the electorate will vote relatively similar. And so I think it's better to focus on a European consensus and on EU membership in the next at least 1 year, where all the personalities who pledge and claim to be for Europe, that they really work together to get all these things done. And then you can have elections and fight a lot about all these internal issues, but focus on EU accession now.
So can we say that the assessment of the European MP, Tonino Picula, realistic that Montenegro can complete negotiations by 2024 and be a full member of the EU by 2025?
I think it's realistic, absolutely. I think it's absolutely not ambitious enough, because I've seen in the case of Croatia, we were much more ambitious, and you can be the next Croatia. And it was absolutely possible that Montenegro votes already in 2024 for the European Parliament elections, or at least to have a preliminary membership already where you send parliamentarians like we did it in Austria. It was in 94, we had the referendum, and in this moment then we sent already preliminary MEPs from the elected MEPs of the parliament to Brussels. And so basically you could do it the same way like Austria or Croatia, or also Bulgaria or Romania, the new members, to be preliminary in 2024 in the European Parliament elections, already the accession treaty signed. And that would be a big success for Europe, because we showed that in this war we are ready to act, and it's a big success for Montenegro, and I call for this target, 2024.
Mr. Fehlinger, thank you very much for making time to be our guest today.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. Best regards from Vienna.
Best regards from Montenegro as well. Poštovani gledaoci, uvaženi slušaoci, bilo je to još jedno izdanje emisije Znam da znaš. Moje ime je Bojana Dabović. Ostanite uz program Gradskog radija i Gradske televizije i želim vam ugodan dan.